All right, welcome back. This time moving on to chapter 10. So chapters 9 and 10 are the nutrition chapters. So chapter 9, hopefully you'll recall, was kind of the basics of nutrition. We talked about carbohydrates and their structure, fat or lipids and their structure, and proteins, etc. Chapter 10 moves on a little bit to be more applied and actually talk about things like pre-game meal, things you could or you should consume post game, that kind of stuff. So now we're getting into more like the nutrition strategies, as you can see from the title, rather than just the basics of nutrition. So, talking about applied stuff, we'll start with pre-competition meal. So there are a few goals behind the pre-competition meal. So the first thing that it's going to help us do is to maintain hydration, because one of the things that I think we'll talk about later in this chapter, if we haven't already, is that by keeping our blood volume up, so if you stay hydrated, that increases your blood plasma volume. And by increasing your blood plasma volume, you make the blood less viscous, so less thick, less sludgy, right? And so then that's easier for the heart to pump. That also gives us some fluid to give up to sweat so that we can keep our core temperature down. Because one of the things that's going to cause fatigue is a core temperature over 102. And so by making sure that we're hydrated before we start our game, before we start our practice, etc., that is going to take some of the workload off of our heart. So that'll help us to deliver oxygen more easily, help us to work at higher intensities for longer. And then second, again, it'll help us keep our core temperature down so that the exercise won't feel quite as difficult. Once your core temperature gets over 102, that's when you start to feel fatigued and you start to see people slow down a little bit. And so one of the ways that we can hopefully push that off or prolong that is by maintaining hydration. As I mentioned last time though, one of the primary drivers of core temperature is the intensity of the exercise. So even if you're well hydrated, if you're performing really intense exercise, you're still going to see a pretty big increase in core temperature, especially if you're exercising in the heat, especially if you're exercising in the sun as well. So anyway, but those things aside, hydration is going to be helpful for performance, as you know. The other thing that we're trying to do with our pre-competition meal, we're trying to maximize our glycogen stores. So if we consume a meal 3 to 4 hours prior to exercise, that's enough time to digest that meal, to get that glucose into the bloodstream, and then to get it back out of the bloodstream and into the muscles and to synthesize it as glycogen. So one of the key things we're trying to do with this pre-competition meal then is to maximize our glycogen stores, both in the muscles and in the liver. Speaking of glycogen, so one of the things that you'll see people try to do, not necessarily with the immediate pre-competition meal, but typically like the night before. So if somebody has a contest on, let's say Saturday, maybe Friday night they'll go, to an Italian restaurant or something and eat a bunch of noodles, and they'll be like, I'm carbohydrate loading. One of the things that I would point out about carbohydrate loading, and my experience there comes from just years of being around recreational runners who put in some effort and they've kind of heard some of the terms like carb loading, but they don't really understand what it means. So if you're going to actually carb load, effectively what you have to do is about a week before the competition, go down to almost zero carbohydrates. So let's say the competition is on a Sunday. The prior Sunday, you're going to do an exhaustive bout of exercise, and this is primarily for endurance athletes, but you could do this for like soccer or basketball athletes as well if they had like one really big game coming up. But so what you're going to do, we'll stick with the endurance athlete example. The Sunday prior to the contest, so 1 week before, an exhaustive bout of exercise. So you're going for probably an hour and a half, maybe even a little bit longer. And then for the rest of the day after that exhaustive bout of exercise, and it would actually be helpful to do that exercise fasted, because then you're already carbohydrate depleted, and then you're really going to finish them off by doing the exhaustive bout of exercise. Then for that day and 3 more following, you're going to do a low to almost no carbohydrate diet. And so what that does is it kind of tricks the body to where the body basically says, uh-oh, I'm not going to get any more carbohydrates. That's a problem. And so then the body tries to figure out, the workarounds. You start getting into ketones and fat metabolism and all that kind of stuff. That's beyond the scope of this discussion. But basically the body kind of panics and tries to figure out what it's going to use since it doesn't have access to carbohydrates. And then about 4 days before the competition, you switch to a higher carbohydrate diet. And then in the 3 days immediately prior on that high carbohydrate diet, you're going to have to consume 8 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per day. So if an athlete weighs 165 pounds, they're going to consume 750 grams of carbohydrates per day during that load. So that's 3,000 calories just from carbohydrates alone in the 3 days immediately leading up to the contest. So where most people go wrong in that example I gave you earlier, particularly recreational athletes, is they'll just eat a high carbohydrate meal and be like, I'm carb loading. But in order to effectively carb load, you have to deplete first. And you have to trick the body into thinking it's never going to see carbohydrates again. Because what it does then is on those 3 days immediately prior to the contest, after having been depleted for several days, it super compensates. So you actually store more glycogen than you normally would, and you'll actually gain a little bit of extra water weight because of it. But by having that increased store of carbohydrates, so rather than having 2,000 calories worth of carbohydrates, maybe you have 2,200 calories worth of carbohydrates, you can go faster and you can go longer before you start to feel fatigued. So thinking about an event like the marathon, where people typically, if they're not supplementing properly, they'll become carbohydrate depleted around mile 20. Maybe you can push that off to mile 22 before they start to really hit the wall, or maybe mile 23 before they start to really hit the wall. So that's the utility of doing that. Back to the pre-competition meal. Keeps hunger pangs at bay. I think pangs is a funny word. But it keeps you from being hungry during the contest, right? So if you haven't eaten for 5-6 hours prior to the contest, you may start to feel hungry. If you've got some downtime, while you're walking around during a basketball game or something, you may start to feel hungry, and so then that can kind of take away from your performance. Another key with the pre-competition meal, so you always want to try whatever it is that you're going to eat in practice first. So you don't want to do anything new on game day, because maybe something that you ate makes you, gives you some gastrointestinal distress, right? So that could be bloating, that could be diarrhea, that kind of stuff, right? And so we want to obviously avoid that on game day. And so in an ideal world, you try out whatever your nutrition strategy is before you get to game day. So that's a key thing. So try the food out in practice first. Another one is that pregame meals, so you want to avoid things that are high in fat and high in fiber. So that is particularly true in terms of, if it's an athlete that normally is, let's say, a vegetarian athlete, and they have a really high fiber diet anyway, consuming what would be high fiber for most people isn't probably going to be a problem for them. But if they, normally are like a white bread, white pasta kind of a person, and you give them, a bunch of whole grains and maybe some vegetables and stuff prior to the game, that may be more fiber than they're used to, and so that can cause some of that gastrointestinal distress, right? So we don't want to have any big uptick in fiber intake, or no more than they're used to in the pregame meal. And then the other thing again is not too much fat intake. So with our vegetarian athlete, if they eat something that's really high in fat, really greasy before the contest, then that may be something that could cause some gastrointestinal distress. And also, things that are high in fiber and high in fat slow down digestion, which is kind of good because then you feel full for longer. But at the same time, if the goal of our pregame meal is to, or really the two big goals are to get glucose into the bloodstream and into the muscle, and then also to hydrate, slowing down gastrointestinal absorption isn't really what I'm going for. So general guideline, you want to avoid things high in fat, high in fiber. So, don't eat pizza and don't eat some fiber supplements. And then the other thing on there as far as minimizing gastrointestinal issues is to avoid sugar alcohols. I don't know what athlete would do this, but I'm sure some would. So you would want to avoid things that are sugar-free. So you don't want to have them eat like sugar-free candy, sugar-free cookies, those kinds of things, because those sugar alcohols are large molecules, and then if you're not used to them, can also cause some gastrointestinal distress. Specifically, the sugar alcohols tend to cause diarrhea. And so again, you want to have them, if they're doing what they normally do with respect to the pregame meal, that's not a problem. But you don't want them to be like, ooh, sugar-free candy, 2 hours before the contest, and they have never eaten that sort of a thing. Then that's when it'll be problematic. So one of the things that the book talks about is that the pregame meal obviously changes depending upon how soon or far from the competition it is. So what this slide is if you're eating around an hour before the competition, here are the food recommendations in the top row, 2 hours, second row, and then 4 more hours, the bottom row. So obviously the farther you eat from the competition, the larger the meal becomes, the higher in fluid it becomes, those kinds of things. As you get closer to the competition, there's a reduction in the volume of the food, reduction in the volume of the calories. Because the other thing, kind of the trade-off here is all of us know we don't want to work out on a full stomach. That's pretty uncomfortable, and that's not really conducive to elite performance. And then minimizing gastrointestinal issues. So this is all the stuff I told you on the first slide, just in table format. And then if you wanted to, the scan didn't come out super great, but it's still readable. That bottom bullet point there is all about the sugar alcohols if you want to read those in more detail. So this is carb loading. So if you were curious about carb loading, here are some examples of how that might be done. So you can see in the left column, that's 8 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram. And again, we're going to do that in the 3 days prior. And you can see what that actually looks like from a practical standpoint. I always find it interesting, some of the things they incorporate here, like the mini pretzels. Like, sure. Fruit jam. Anyway, so that's the 8 to 10 grams. That's kind of the baseline recommendation for your, if you had an athlete that's getting ready for something like an Ironman, some sort of ultra endurance kind of a thing, then you could go down to that second row and do 10 to 12 grams of carbohydrate. That is a ton of carbohydrates. And so, like for somebody like a soccer player, that may not be appropriate. That's probably too much. And they could do more like the 8 to 10 grams. But again, that more extreme endurance would be the 10 to 12 grams. All right, so fluid consumption. We talked about the idea behind making sure that they are properly hydrated is to take some of the workload off of the heart by increasing plasma volume, decreasing the viscosity of the blood. And we also talked about the idea, or the second idea behind that is by increasing plasma volume, you have more fluid to give up as sweat, and so that'll help keep your core temperature down. So those are kind of the twofold ideas behind ensuring that the athletes are properly hydrated before starting the contest. But even once the contest is going, because this is during event nutrition, you're going to want to make sure that they consume a little bit of fluid throughout the contest. So for example, if we're talking about kids, so 88 pounds and less, they should consume 5 ounces of cold water or a flavored salted beverage every 20 minutes. So 5 ounces every 20 minutes, so 15 ounces an hour. So 2 small juice glasses basically, or a pint if you want to look at it that way, right? Now that said, that seems like a lot of fluid to me, and I can't imagine getting a kid to drink that much, but that is the recommendation. And then for adolescents now, so 132 pounds and less, we would want them to drink 9 ounces every 20 minutes. So now you're drinking 27 ounces, so almost a full liter during the course of an hour of intense exercise. So again, seems a little high, but that is the recommendation. In terms of carbohydrate supplementation, so obviously we can have the athletes consume carbohydrates during the event. So the typical way that manifests itself is that the athletes drink something like Gatorade or Body Armor or Powerade or whatever your sports drink of choice is. That's a really good route to go as far as carbohydrate supplementation goes. By supplementing with carbohydrates, so by having them drink Gatorade, for example, during an event, what that's going to do is obviously you'll absorb that into the intestine, it'll move into the bloodstream, so that'll keep your blood sugar up. And so by providing that supplemental form of carbohydrates, then the muscles can use that instead of using glycogen. And so what happens is that you're able to, again, use the blood glucose instead of the glycogen, and so that's called a glycogen sparing effect. You're not using your onboard fuel source because you have this supplemental fuel source, and so because of that, that should extend endurance performance so they can go harder and they can go longer. So carbohydrate supplementation does improve performance during exercise. It reduces perception of exertion, doesn't feel like you're working quite as hard. And it also probably has the added benefit of reducing the suppression of the immune system after exercise. So one of the things that happens is if we have our, particularly our endurance athletes like cross-country runners who have these really high training volumes, so some exercise is good and actually boosts immune function, but lots and lots of exercise can be bad in terms of suppressing immune function. So there's some evidence that our endurance athletes like the cross-country runners are more susceptible to things like colds, which are usually framed or discussed as being upper respiratory tract infections because of that suppression of the immune system due to the high volume of training. And so then there's also some evidence that by supplementing with carbohydrates during their training and during their competition, that helps offset that reduction in immune system functioning. So there's that. So added benefit there. One of the interesting things about this, as far as carbohydrate supplementation goes, is that you can actually, they don't even have to drink them. They can actually just put it in their mouth and then rinse and spit, and that still enhances performance. So the number cited by the book is that increases performance by 2 to 3%, just the swish and spit method of carbohydrate. So rather than, like I said, rather than swallowing your Gatorade, you just rinse Gatorade through your mouth and spit it out. And so that probably has an effect on the central nervous system. Basically, you kind of trick the brain into thinking that it has access to carbohydrates. And so because of that, that reduces your perception of exertion. You don't feel like you're working quite as hard. As far as endurance versus strength or power sports, so endurance sports benefit the most directly from consuming additional carbohydrates during them. If we're thinking about things like, in terms of strength power sports, things like football, powerlifting, strongman, those kinds of things, certainly those benefit from carbohydrate consumption during the event, but it's more important for your endurance sports. So again, cross-country running or similar types of events, longer swims, longer cycling events, but also things like soccer and basketball. On strength and power sports, again, they could consume a Gatorade bar at halftime, or they could consume Gatorade during the event. It's only going to help their performance, provided, so again, there is a happy medium, right? Like you can consume too many carbohydrates during the performance, and that also can cause gastrointestinal distress. But it's unlikely. Like typically, to overconsume carbohydrates, it ends up being like a really concentrated form of carbohydrates, like apple juice for some people. If they just do like 8 ounces of apple juice with no additional fluid, that can be too concentrated. And of course, in a sport context, nobody's really drinking anything like that. People are drinking Gatorade or Body Armor, whatever your beverage of choice is on the sideline. All right, so there's some of the recommendations I just talked about. So children, 88 pounds, 5 ounces, all that, adolescents, all that stuff. And then the fourth bullet point there is the recommendation for carbohydrate consumption. So 30 to 90 grams for each hour during prolonged exercise. So somewhere between 120 and 360 calories of carbohydrates per hour. 360 is a lot, but it depends on the length of the event. So if we're thinking about something like the marathon, then 360 isn't quite as much. But if we're thinking about something like a 10K or soccer game or something like that, 120, 200 will get you by. Not really sure why they threw tennis players on there, but they did. So if you're interested in tennis, there's a very specific recommendation for them. All right, so what happens after the event? So our post-event nutrition. So last time in Chapter 9, we talked about the glycemic index. So post-event nutrition, you want to consume high glycemic carbohydrates. So simple sugars, basically, things that are very readily absorbed. Because you want them easily digested, easily incorporated into the bloodstream. The faster you can get them into the muscles, the faster we're going to regenerate our glycogen stores. So that's the rationale for consuming high glycemic carbohydrates after exercise. You also want to incorporate some protein, so 20 to 30 grams, and you can see you want that 20 to 30 grams every 3 to 4 hours post-exercise. I think for the first, you probably want for the first 12 hours, probably 12 hours after exercise. And the idea there is that the combination of protein and high glycemic carbs seems to be more effective at causing glycogen resynthesis than carbohydrates alone. So the addition of protein is helpful. And so what that does then is the faster you can regenerate your glycogen stores, the faster you can recover and be ready for the next exercise bout. So not only is this important this is particularly important in the context of things like tournaments. So if they're playing multiple games in a day, or events like swimming or track where you've got multiple events in a day, similar concept, right? So we can recover from the first one and be ready for the second one. But it also becomes important in training camp. If you've got 2 practices, one in the morning, one at night, and then you have multiple days in a row of multiple practices, then that recovery becomes particularly important. So the faster we can get them to rebuild their muscles, to remake their glycogen, the better it is. So the idea behind post-event nutrition, kind of one of the ways to think about it is during the exercise, the body is kind of in teardown mode, right? So we talked about the effect of epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol. All those hormones have the effect of breaking down muscle, of freeing up glycogen, those kinds of things. So during exercise, the body's in teardown mode, and then post-exercise, we want to shift into rebuilding mode, and the way to do that is by consuming food after exercise, specifically high glycemic carbs and protein. So for your aerobic endurance events post-exercise, so you want 1 gram to 1.85 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram every hour for 5 hours post-exercise. And then for our high-intensity intermittent sports, so those include things like soccer, basketball, lacrosse, hockey, those kinds of sports, they would follow the same recommendations as our aerobic endurance events. So on the bottom end, 1 gram of carbohydrate for every kilogram of body weight every hour for 5 hours post-exercise. Strength and power sports, it's not quite as big of a deal. For them, the protein recommendations are a little bit higher, and I'll show you what those look like here in a second. But the carbohydrate recommendations are basically the same, maybe a little lower. All right, so related to protein then. So if we've got our low to moderate endurance stuff, so you can see they're jogging or triathlons, these are probably more like, I'm guessing not Ironmans, because the protein intake is pretty low. So thinking back to last time, remember that the baseline protein recommendation is 0.8 grams of protein for every kilogram of body weight. And so it's a little bit higher for athletes, right? So for our endurance athletes, rather than being 0.8 gram per kilogram, it's 1 to 1.1. For our higher level endurance athletes, it's higher than 1.6 grams per kilogram. And then for things like weightlifting, it's even higher, so 1.5 to 2 grams. So if you're familiar, like growing up in gyms and stuff, like working in gyms as early as high school, one of the things I heard all the time around the gym was like you needed to get 1 gram of protein for every pound of body weight, right? And so remember that for every kilogram, that's 2.2 pounds. Okay, and so basically, if you're doing 1 gram per pound, that is equivalent to doing 2 grams per kilo. So it's on the high end there. And then this stuff I won't read to you, but different performance goals, there are some of the recommendations. Obviously, it's in the textbook, but it's also posted for you on the slideshow, so you had easy access to it in case you didn't have the textbook. So that's a helpful little table there. All right, so if we want to alter body composition, if we want to gain muscle mass, if we want to lose fat mass, that's altering body composition. So how do we do that with respect to nutrition? So obviously, in order to lose fat mass, you need to expend more calories than you consume, right? You need to create an energy deficit. So how do we do that? Well, in order to do that, there are a few things to take into account. The first is resting metabolic rate, which is how many calories you burn just sitting around. Your resting metabolic rate itself is a product of your body composition. So the higher lean mass you have, the more muscle mass you have, then the higher your energy requirements are. The smaller person you are, the smaller muscle mass you have, then you're going to have a little bit lower resting metabolic rate. Thermic effect of food describes the amount of energy it takes to break down food. So things like protein are more difficult to break down than simple carbohydrates. There's some energy input required to break them down. Same kind of thing, fiber is a little bit harder to break down, causes a higher thermic effect. So really kind of protein and fiber are the big two that are harder to break down. Fat less so, and then carbohydrates even less so. And then obviously physical activity. The more physical activity you have, the more calories you burn, and then that obviously creates or can help create a caloric deficit. So in order to estimate energy requirements, we're going to use the table on the next slide. One of the things, that second bullet point at the bottom, or the very bottom bullet point, that's a really important thing, is food diaries. So especially if somebody wants to lose weight, we want to make sure that they are writing down what it is that they're eating, because oftentimes people will eat more than they think, but if they have to sit there and write it down every time, that is really, really handy. So even, for your own purposes, if you're ever looking to lose weight, I can't recommend that highly enough. And then the other thing that food diaries are helpful for is to help people realize how big portions are. So if they actually have to weigh out their food and they have to measure, how many servings of meat they had, I think that can be a real eye-opener, because as you can imagine, we tend to overestimate portion sizes and be like, oh, this is 1 serving of meat, but it turns out it's 2, maybe 2.5, right? So that's one of the other things that food diaries are really helpful for. All right, so if we're going to estimate caloric needs, what we'll do here, so on the left side, you've got a male. On the right side, you've got a female. So if we have, I'm going to pull up my calculator as I'm talking. So if we have a female who is moderately active, and you can see at the very bottom of the screen, moderate activity means that they walk 3.5 to 4 miles per hour, which is a pretty brisk walk. Most of us kind of walk in that 3.0 to 3.3 range if you're just like walking to class and stuff. Cycling, tennis, skiing. So moderate activity level is kind of your recreationally active person. So for them, we're going to go with a recreationally active female, or moderately active female. And we're going to go on the low end of her calorie needs. So we're going to say that she weighs, we'll say 125 pounds, and then she needs 17 calories per pound. So she would need then 2,125 calories on the low end in order to maintain her weight. So if for some reason she is looking to lose weight, then she would want to consume a few less calories than that to create that deficit, right? So kind of one of the general guidelines, and it's not as neat as this or not as clean as this, but one of the general guidelines is that there are approximately 3,500 calories in every pound of fat. And so if you can create, a 500 calorie deficit over the course of 7 days, you can lose a pound of fat over the course of 7 days. So in order to do that, maybe you reduce your consumption by 250 calories, and then you increase your expenditure by 250 calories. So you go walk 2.5 miles, and then you somehow cut out 250 calories from what you normally consume. And then by doing that again over the course of the week, you'll hopefully lose somewhere in the neighborhood of a pound. Of course, metabolism isn't quite that straightforward. There's some other factors that play into it, but that's a good general idea of a way to start losing weight. So if we're dealing with athletes that want to gain weight, so thinking about, athletes like our football players, sometimes our weightlifters, wrestlers, those kinds of athletes. So typically we want them to put on weight during the off season, as you would expect. And so we're going to go the other way that I just described to you with them. So we want them to consume 500 additional calories per day. So maybe that's as little as adding a meal, but typically you kind of spread that out across the course of the day. And then we also want to increase their protein intake. So if they're not already, we want them to consume 1.5 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. So again, that 2 grams per kilogram is getting pretty close to a gram per pound, which is a little bit easier math for most of us. And then, so on the sports nutrition or on the sports dietitian part, one of the big things there I'd say is just, as we're advising somebody to increase calorie intake, we just want to make sure that it's not like garbage calories, right? We don't want them going to McDonald's and be like, boom, 500 more calories. So, we want to do it through increasing, obviously, protein if they're not already meeting those guidelines. So we want to increase protein consumption, increase complex carbohydrates, maybe increase healthy fats, so have them work in more nuts to their diet if that's economically feasible, those kinds of things. So, and with respect to the sports dietitian, that's one of the things that they're really good at is coming up with different ideas for sources of additional calories that are more healthful than, like I said, McDonald's. If they want to lose fat, so going the other way. So again, we want to create a deficit. Doesn't have to be 500 calories a day, but it can be. Probably shouldn't be much more than that though, because, and you'll see some of this on the later slides here in a second, the faster you lose the weight, the more likely you are to regain it, but also faster weight loss. So if you lose, the general recommendation is a pound per week. So if you lose it faster than that, let's say you lose 5 pounds in a week, more of that weight tends to come from muscle mass, because we can't just selectively lose fat mass. While we lose fat mass, we also lose a little bit, or tend to lose a little bit of muscle mass as well. And so the steeper that drop off in weight, the greater proportion of that tends to come from lean mass, so places like muscle mass, which we don't want. Because if they then return to their previous calorie consumption, then they have reduced muscle mass, they have a reduced resting metabolic rate, they're going to regain that weight faster. And so, as you can imagine, that's problematic. That bottom, not bullet point, but bottom line there. So you can see that's a really high protein consumption there. So if they're losing weight, we're going to have them consume 1.8 to 2.7 grams per kilogram. The idea behind that is by having them consume so much protein, hopefully that'll minimize that muscle loss. And so there won't be such a pronounced effect on resting metabolic rate on the other side. I'm trying to think what else I was going to say there. Oh yeah, that's what I was going to say. So oftentimes to get that much protein, they're going to have to consume supplements, so things like whey protein or whatever. And so one of the things I would say is if they're consuming 2.7 grams per kilogram, you would want to look at their fiber consumption, because so much protein with insufficient fiber can cause constipation. So that may be the inclusion of a fiber supplement, so something like Metamucil, or just making sure that they're getting enough fruits and vegetable sources of actual fiber. That would be preferred, but if we can't manage that, then the fiber supplements will work as well. BMI you're familiar with, so it's a height-weight ratio. So when you see all the statistics about, there's one actually I saw this week that came out that 4 additional states since the pandemic started had obesity rates 35% or higher, right? So 35% or more of the population of that state has a BMI over 30. That's how that's measured. And so typically what they'll do is they'll just, do phone call or some other survey where they say, okay, how tall are you? How much do you weigh? And then they'll do a BMI. So one of the drawbacks to BMI is that it doesn't account for body composition. So body composition is how much of you is lean mass and how much of you is fat mass. So that's where you see percentages. So for example, if we say that the average college age male has a body fat percentage of 12 to 15%. So of their body composition, or their body is composed of 12 to 15% fat, everything else is non-fat or lean mass. So that's a body composition number. So the way that we get body composition, that can be through like skin folds where you have to pinch on somebody. That can be through DEXA, which is an X-ray imaging technology that you probably haven't seen. That can be through bioelectrical impedance, which you've probably used in some of your classes where you hold the handles on the machine and it tells you a percentage. That's body fat. So that's different than BMI. So BMI, again, is just a height-weight ratio. And so again, one of the drawbacks is that it doesn't take into account that body composition. So if you have somebody that is, like think about a linebacker or a defensive end in the NFL if you're a football fan. Like those guys are huge, they're very tall, they have really large wingspans, and they also have lots and lots of lean mass, right? They're really muscular and they tend to be fairly lean. But if you just look at a height-weight ratio, they would end up being technically obese, right? Because they've got so much muscle mass, they've got so much weight, again, doesn't account for how that weight's made up, but they've got so much weight relative to their height that they would be considered obese. So that's one of the drawbacks to BMI. Now that said, oftentimes people will be like, well, I know, by BMI I'm obese, but it doesn't account for all my, it doesn't account for my body composition, it doesn't account for my lean mass, because I work out once monthly, and so therefore I have excess muscle mass, and so that BMI number is inaccurate. They have to be involved in pretty regular training in order for BMI to be an inaccurate assessment of disease risk, because that's really what it is. So that number, if you're over 30, then you're obese, and so all that means then is that you are at an increased risk of a variety of diseases, including things like diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So there's the numbers. So things to know with BMI, you kind of want to know the cut points. So they're on there, but they're on here as well. This is a little handier chart. So here are BMI numbers to be familiar with. So normal BMI is anywhere between 18.5 to 24.9. Anybody over 25 or 25 and over is overweight. Once they hit 30, that's the next cut point. So 30 is obesity, 35 is class 2 obese, and 40 is class 3 obese. So they used to have a little bit different terminology. So class 3 obese used to be morbidly obese, if you're familiar with that terminology. So they just replaced morbidly with class 3 now. And then somebody who's under 18.5 is underweight, right? So if I were you, I'd be familiar with kind of that sweet spot of 18.5 to 24.9. That's normal. 25 is overweight, 30 is obese, 35 is class 2 obese, and then 40 is class 3 obese. Because that'll also help you in other classes. Those, like I said, those cut points are pretty useful things to be familiar with. So as mentioned, the idea behind BMI is to get an idea of disease risk. And so people who have a BMI over 30, so who are classified as obese, have a higher risk of morbidity, higher risk of developing all the diseases that you see listed there. So hypertension is high blood pressure. Dyslipidemia is high blood lipids, which is associated with coronary heart disease, the bullet point right below it. Gallbladder disease, so things like gallstones, which fortunately I've not experienced, but I've heard are incredibly painful. A family friend developed them recently, and it was a really drawn out condition for her. Apparently incredibly painful, and she lost a bunch of weight. So anyway, if you can avoid that, you'd want to. High risk of stroke, type 2 diabetes, high risk of respiratory problems, and then a host of different cancers: endometrial, breast, prostate, and colon. So as mentioned, the faster you lose weight, the more likely you are to regain it. You're also going to see a greater reduction in muscle mass, which we don't want. But oftentimes athletes in particularly body weight sports, so things like powerlifting, weightlifting, athletes in sports like wrestling, boxing, all those combat sports, all those have weight classes. And so the athlete may need to be under a particular number in order to be eligible for their event. And so to make sure they're under that number, oftentimes athletes will engage in some potentially dangerous strategies to lose weight at the last minute. So usually, the fastest ways, if I'm being honest, to lose weight in the course, you got a week to turn it around, you got to lose some weight. The fastest ways to lose weight are to go on a low carbohydrate diet. So if you go on a low carb diet, over the course of that week, you're going to lose, depending on your initial body size and nutrition status, you're going to lose probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 pounds. And that 5 pound loss is not a loss of fat mass, but that 5 pound loss is largely from glycogen depletion. So if you're on a low carb diet, you're not consuming carbohydrates, and so you're going to run through all your glycogen. And so glycogen, when you store it, also, like creatine, brings water with it. And so if you deplete your glycogen, you lose weight because you lose, as you have gotten rid of or used up those carbohydrates, you've lost the water that has followed them into the muscle. And so then you'll see a pretty pronounced reduction in body weight. So if somebody really needs to make weight fast, have them do low carbohydrates for a few days. Not that I recommend that, but that is how that's often done. And so then they will lose a few pounds. And then to lose additional water mass, you'll often see people, you see voluntary dehydration there, and I know this from powerlifting. You'll often see people on top of the water losses from glycogen depletion. They'll do things to they just intentionally dehydrate themselves. So they're not consuming very much water, but in addition to not consuming very much water, potentially they'll take diuretics, so to make you excrete additional water, and or do things like go sit in the sauna, go sit in the hot tub, which is extra dangerous. If you are doing that, don't sit in the hot tub. Sauna is a little bit safer. They're both dangerous, but the sauna is a little bit safer. And so by doing that, now you've lost additional water mass. And so with that, you've lost additional weight. And so maybe then they'll be able to make it under the magic number on the scale. But of course, an athlete that does that, they're at risk of hurting their performance because they're going to go in poorly nourished. But on top of that, just the process of getting there, of sitting in the sauna when you're already dehydrated, obviously you increase your risk of developing heat illness, right? And potentially heat stroke. So something to be aware of there. Thermogenic aids, thinking about that. I don't know if there are any legal thermogenic aids that work anymore. Things like ephedrine used to be things that were popular, but ephedrine is still available, but just not as a supplement anymore. Laxatives would also get rid of some water. All right, so if they lose too much weight too quickly, again, there are kind of the drawbacks to that. So you're going to lose lean mass. Obviously, you're going to feel tired. You're going to have headaches, and you're going to be pretty angry. Dehydration is sort of what you're going for, but that dehydration can cause heat illness. You may have some cramps and then have some dizziness because of that low blood volume, or because you're too hot. And then some of the other drawbacks to that. So suppressed immune system functioning, affects your hormones, reduce strength, reduce power, etc. These things down here, these are kind of in the extremes, but those do happen. Back when I was in high school, so a long time ago, but back when I was in high school, there were some wrestlers who ended up dying because they were in a sauna wearing solar suits, kind of like trash bag sort of things, and like exercising. I think one was on a bike and the other ones were doing jumping jacks or something, trying to lose as much water as fast as possible. And so they ended up dying of, at least one of them ended up dying of heat stroke and kidney failure. So the eating disorders, I'm not going to go through with you because you're probably familiar with them as a concept. So anorexia, I'm sure you've all heard of, but if nothing else, there's a pretty thorough description on all the slides. So I'll let you read those yourself, because these are all posted. Binge eating disorder or bulimia, probably familiar with that as well. Again, there's bulimia. This one is kind of a similar one and sort of has some crossovers with anorexia. But the interesting little wrinkle here is this mid, or the second bullet there, avoidance of food based on the sensory characteristics. Like there may be certain, crunchiness or whatever, like tactile sort of sensations of the food that bother them. So that's it is similar to anorexia, but there is, like I said, that little interesting wrinkle there. These two you probably haven't heard of. Pica I'd only ever heard of in pregnant women, which is that they're eating non-food substances. So that includes things, it's not on there, but I'd heard of soap as something that was commonly eaten. And so obviously it's there's some sort of an alteration in brain function, whether due to hormones or some other cause, but that leads to someone eating non-food items. So I'm not really sure why they included that in the strength and conditioning book, but I guess you could encounter an athlete with that. And then rumination disorder is kind of similar to the other eating disorders. Probably most similar to bulimia. So, a cow is a ruminant where they chew their food up and then it ends up coming back into the mouth to be rechewed. So rumination disorder is the chewing and spitting and then rechewing of regurgitated food. So like I said, similar to bulimia, but I think the idea there is just not to swallow it. So you might encounter that in an athlete, maybe, because you'll encounter bulimic athletes or athletes with eating disorders, anorexia. So potentially rumination disorder is one that you might come across. It'd be helpful to know about that one. Like I said, pica, less likely. All right, so that's it for chapter 10. And so then next time we will move on to chapter 11 and we'll talk about ergogenic aids, which are things that enhance performance. So we'll see you then.